web technology. Here, server-side programming. The session is going to be discussed about the server-side programming. Okay. So, what is mean by server-side programming? The client is going to ask something involving in the web browser, and the server is also be involved in the web browser to answer for the client. Okay, if the client is asking some queries, it is going to be answered by the server. So to perform the function, server-side programming has to be returned. Okay, so it is handled by web development technologies, that is Java server pages and higher level web development technologies, and mainly it is handled by the servlets. Okay, the contents here are Java servlet, servlet architecture overview, servlet generating dynamic content, servlet lifecycle. Okay, so this is based mainly for the web application. Okay, let us get into the session. It is Java servlets. Okay, so what is mean by Java servlets? It is a technology for generating dynamic web pages. Dynamic web pages, that is the pages, if you are trying to click in the browser one page and you are trying to click another page, means it will be, the pages will be changed frequently according to the request from the client. Okay, the dynamic pages has to be executed properly. So like PHP, ASP.NET. Okay, so the protocol and platform independent server side components written in Java which extend the standard web servers. Though this has to be handled by the Java servlets. Here, why the Java servlets are used means maximum importance is given to Java servlets, means that is platform independent server side. So it is completely like Java, it is also platform independent server side component. So the program written here is also involved Java. Okay. Java programs that serve HTTP request. Since the Java programs will serve HTTP request. So the HTTP servlet is also a class file, provides dynamic web content. Okay, where dynamic web content and dynamic web content generations is also generated by means of HTML and XML. Okay. So next one, servlet architecture overview. So what does mean by servlet architecture? Architecture, how the request and response are handled in a servlet. Okay, that is the overall architecture. That is what here we are going to see. HTML documents that contain JavaScript, embedded other technologies such as Java applets can change the content and the structure of the browser representation of the document in response to various events, that is pop-up, dialog, windows and so on. So the combination of HTML plus JavaScript and the DOM is sometimes referred to as dynamic HTML. Okay, so this is going to be handled through the architecture. We will see how it is handled overall function. See, web browser, that is nothing but the client will give HTTP request. Since the HTTP request is an object that that will give request to the web server. Okay, the web server will give request to the servlet. Since the servlet is a container, why web server can handle the queries. Even the web server can easily handle the queries that is given by the web browser. But when multiple clients are supposed to give request at the same time, means there will arise a there the serve there arise a problem. Okay, so to handle that, a servlet is an engine that will answer for the client request. So it is handled by the servlet. Okay, so when we think that is it is mainly based, it is mainly used where the servlet is mainly used, you can say that is in Amazon, in Flipkart, or otherwise business websites, or form filling. You're going if a form is going to be filled by the government applications or companies, their multiple request will be raised at a single time. So it is not properly handled by a web server. The servlet will handle this situation properly. When multiple hits came at the same time, it is handled by the servlet properly. So it will access the data from the database and it will send the data to the database properly. So the response is also handled by the servlet through HTTP response object, and the web server will give response to the HTTP through HTTP response object to the web browser, that is to the client. Okay, this is the architecture overview. When an instruction is given to the web server, that web server will get the HTTP request and will answer for the HTTP response to the web server. So this is the overall architecture. Okay. The combination of HTML plus JavaScript and the DOM is sometimes referred to as dynamic HTML, that is DHTML. Often the pages will be changed according to the client request and response. The response by a web server to an HTTP request. So here you see a request is given from a client, that is web browser, to the web server. That web server to the HTTP request, இந்த web serverல இருந்து HTTP request வந்து it is going to the servlet. There the request can be classified as static or dynamic. Okay, so the static response is in a static response, that is the response by a web server to an HTTP request can be classified as static or dynamic. So when a request is given, that is okay, you will be getting request from the web server to the servlet. So the response has to be handled by the servlet. So what type of response it can handle means two types, that is one may be static response or another one may be dynamic response. When the web server is not responsible for generating the content, it's simply finding and sending the content that was generated by some other process. So look at here, the static response means it will find the content what the web server is requested. It will search from the database and fetch the page, whatever the content the web server needs, and finally find the content, and it won't modify the content, it won't change any data from in the content, and simply it will give response to the web server. It is said to be static response. When it is considered to dynamic means the content of response is directly generated by the software on the server. The content is going to be generated by the software on the server. Let us I will give a simple example. If you are supposed to give an application, that is a filled application form, and you are for a job, and you are going to complete the application, and it is going to be sent as a request to the web server to the servlet, and that request will be generated, your name, your address and your photos, and will be stored in the database. Have you understood? And it will generate a completed processed application form, okay, and it will give response to the web server as a completed process. So this can be considered as a dynamic response, an example for dynamic response. Have you understood? Okay. This okay, that is said to be when you feel, if you are requesting some form, means it will simply get the form and shows it in the web browser, that is on the client side, means it is considered as a static response. There is no other generation, no other there is no other process it is going to handle. That is considered as static response. So you all get understood with the static and dynamic response. Okay, see here, when an HTTP request message is received by a servlet capable server, it first determines based on the URL of the request. So it will determine from which URL the request is came, okay. That is, you are supposed to give in the URL, that is www dot any website name, okay. So it will generate from the URL, okay. The servlet next determines from the URL which servlet should handle the request. So the servlet only determines from which you are if you are you will be generating multiple request, okay. Once if you have opened a net, you will be supposed to give more than one request in your website from your IP address itself. Okay, so it will handle the from which URL should handle the request, okay, from which URL the request has to be handled, calls a method on the servlet. So here the two parameters, that is the object, will be passed, that is object implementing HTTP servlet request interface, object implementing HTTP servlet response interface. So these two are considered as an object, that is request is an object that is going to be interfaced with the servlet, and the response is also a object that is going to be interface with the web server and also with the web browser, okay. So here see, first one is number one, HTTP request, that is request is from the web browser to the web server, and this request is passed to the web, that is request objects, through request objects to the servlet, and the modified response object will be passed from the servlet to the web server, and fourth one is HTTP response. Finally, this is the architecture overview. This is high level web server servlet interface. This is said to be high level web server interaction or interaction, okay ma'am. Okay, so see here, a web server handling a servlet request generally operates as follows. That is, when a HTTP request message is received by a servlet capable server, it first determines based on the URL of the request. That request should be handled by a servlet, okay. When the servlet method has finished its processing, it returns control to the server. The server next determines from the URL which servlet should handle the request and calls a method on the servlet. Two parameters are passed. That is, two parameters are passed to the method, and object implementing the HTTP servlet request interface and an object implementing the HTTP servlet response interface. Both of these interfaces are defined as a part of the Java Servlet API, okay. So the servlet method executes typically calling method on the HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. The server formats the information stored in the HTTP servlet response object by the servlet into the HTTP response manager. Okay, so here the explanation of the architecture diagram on the previous page. Simply the overall explanation of the architecture. A client application sends an HTTP request to the server. The servlet container receives the request and directs it to be processed by the appropriate servlet. The servlet does its processing, which may include interacting with a database or other server-side components, such as other servlets or JSP. The servlet returns its result to the client, normally in the form of HTML, XHTML, or XML document to display in a browser. Okay, that's all. This is the architecture gets completed. Now, servlet generating dynamic content. Okay, how the static content is not at all a problem, since it will find the static page from the database and it will display the page simply. Okay, but dynamic content plays a important role. Why? Servlet generating dynamic content. When the web server starts, it creates its single instance of the hello counter class servlet. This is the default behavior of any server compiling with the Java servlet. Many commercial web applications. Okay, what is mean by here? Supposed to be commercial web application is nothing but that is doing business with the web on the web, where generally we can consider Amazon. Okay, that is said to be commercial web application or replicated over multiple servers, so they won't have only one server to answer for the clients. They will have many multiple servers, so that multiple servers will get request at a same time. That server is handled by the how the response has to be handled by can be handled by the servlets, and therefore do not conform with the single instant of a single servlet. In multiple users access this servlet at nearly the same time, the multiple execution of the servlet do get method may interleave in a way that cause different users to see the same visit count. Okay, the same visit count has to be maintained properly. Multiple users are trying to access the same site means the hit count has to be maintained properly. Okay, so multiple execution of the servlets do get method may interleave in a way that cause different users to see the same visit count. Okay, so the visit counter is given in book. You refer a hello world, a simple execution program. There visit since most recent server restart is the hit count is given, that is 4. Okay, the next important topic is servlet life cycle. So servlet life cycle, so how it is handled? A servlet life cycle, that is simply every life cycle will have a start, process and end. This is a common thing. Okay, this start, process and end, how it is handled technically, let us see. A servlet life cycle can be defined as a entire process from its creation till the destruction. The following are the paths followed by a servlet. The servlet is initialized by calling. The servlet is initialized. It has to be initialized, okay, by calling init method. Okay. and the servlet calls service method. So it will call the service method to process a client's request. And then finally the servlet is terminated by calling the destroy method. Okay, finally servlet is garbage collected by the garbage collection of the JVM. Okay, so how this init method, service method and process method is having inbuilt class, that is inbuilt methods, and how it calls, how it creates. Let us see. The init method is called only once. So it cannot be called multiple times. So only once. It is called only when the servlet is created. Once when a web browser gives its request to web server and the web server sends its HTTP request to the servlet, then only based on the request the init method is called. Okay, only when the server hits the servlet is generated and the init method is called for any user request. The init method simply creates or loads some data that will be used throughout the life of the servlet. Okay, see here, public void init throws servlet exception. Okay, public void init throws servlet exception. Within that any program can, that is a coding, can be written. And then coming to the service method, the service method is the main method to perform the actual task. So what is the initialization is nothing but it is the servlet is started and the based on the request the process is going to be handled. The servlet container calls the service method to handle a request coming from the client and to write the formatted response back to the client. Okay. Each time the server receives a request for a servlet, the server spans a new thread and calls service. Each time the server receives a request for a servlet, the server spans a new thread. So it will form a new thread. Many servlet will be initialized at a same time. Many requests will be given from the web server to the servlet. So a thread will be created for the initialization process and then destroy. That is a initialization, service and destroy. Okay, so the service method checks the HTTP request type, in what type of the request is came from the web server, get, post, put, delete, etc. and calls based on that request. It calls do get, do post, do put, do delete, etc. methods as appropriate. Okay, so you see here, public void service, servlet request, comma, servlet response, that has to be closed, throws servlet exception, IO exception. Okay, so next the do get method. Next method is going to be what type of service the service, what type of service has to be handled is how and how it is handled. See, do get method. A get request result from a normal request for a URL or form an HTML form that has no method specified and it should be handled by do get method. Okay, so public void do get, HTTP servlet request, HTTP servlet response throws servlet exception. Okay, IO exception. So this is the method do get method. And then do post is handled by the post request result from the HTML form that specially list post as a method and it should be handled by do post method. So do post is handled by the do post method and destroy is nothing but final thing, that is the servlet life cycle is going to be closed, is called, it is also like initialization, it is called only once at the end of the life cycle of a servlet. This method gives your servlet a chance to close the database connection. Finally it will close the database connection. So how it is handled means through by calling the destroy method. Okay, see here the architecture diagram of a servlet lifecycle scenario. First, HTTP request coming to the server or delegated to the servlet container. Okay, here from the servlet container, the architecture is seen. A servlet container loads a servlet before invoking the service method. Okay, everything is handled by a threads. So thread A will have init service destroy, and thread B will have init service and destroy. Every hits will form a thread, and through that thread the servlet will be handled. Then the servlet container handles multiple requests by spanning multiple threads, each thread executing the service method of a single instance of the service. Okay, each thread will handle a multiple instance of the service. Okay, and then the request is a request to the servlet container is handled. From the servlet container, the request is given to the web server and then to the web browser, that is to the client. So the architecture of the servlet lifecycle is handled through this different methods. Okay, that's all. The session is ended. Thank you.